All right, we're recording. Hi, I'm Jeff. I'm a Goy for Jesus. I am. So one of the things I do is a bunch of paranormal stuff from a Christian perspective. And one of the books I've been highly recommending to a lot of people is a 2-volume set that I read last year. I guess I could say last year now. Where the Footprints End, and we have one of the co-authors on, Joshua Cutchin. Joshua, I'm really pleased to have you on. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, how the book came to be, and what the thesis of the book is, and we can go from there.
Let's see, my paranormal origin story, I guess I'll try to keep it quick. I've always been a monster kid. And there was a time when I was working a desk job at UGA, that the University of Georgia, that I realized that whatever I was doing in my life was not working out for me. At the same time, I was listening to a bunch of paranormal podcasts, of which there are a ton of awesome ones out there. And it really catalyzed me to sort of actually write my first book, because I found some similarities that no one had talked about, specifically the intersection of, food and drink in these paranormal encounters.
Which book is that?
That's A Trojan Feast.
Okay.
From 2015. Yeah. So I quit the desk job and started writing and teaching private lessons and playing more music again.
What do you play?
I play tuba, and just tuba, not bass, not anything else, just tuba. So not a heavy work schedule, but there's enough work.
It reminds me of my friend's old joke, like, how do trombonists keep track of their gigs? A year at a glance calendar.
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard that one. I've heard a lot of wind instrument and brass player jokes, but I've not heard that one. That was great. Yeah, but Oktoberfest and Mardi Gras are always really busy. And I actually before the pandemic, I was staying pretty busy, and it's coming back in fits and starts, as we're all familiar with in our own lives, I'm sure. But this specific book, came about in 2018 when my good friend Tim Renner said he wanted to sort of do the definitive guide to high strangeness in Bigfoot. And he was thinking of like an encyclopedia, and he wanted to sort of share it with me. And I think I took it in a different direction, but it ended up being something that we're both very proud of. 2-volume work.
You should be. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm really excited. Well, I'll back up a little bit. We are really humbled by the reception that it's gotten. I think it's Timothy and I's most popular book, respectively. And the community seemed to be really ready for this in a lot of ways. The Bigfoot field is dominated by people who are adherent to the flesh and blood hypothesis. And if you take a look at this stuff and you're treating all witnesses as equal, which there's a lot of hypocrisy in the Bigfoot community we can get into regarding that. But if you're treating all witnesses as equal, then you have to say that there are some strange things. People will say, oh, the Bigfoot didn't vanish. It just jumped behind a tree. And I'm like, well, if you keep walking that logic back, you wind up at, you saw a bear, right? If you're not taking people at their word. Mm-hmm. So what I want to say earlier about being excited, I'm really excited to talk to you because I am a Christian myself, and that is an absolute tightrope to walk in these fields, as I'm sure you're aware. Before I got my job at UGA, I was a youth pastor for a brief time.
What denomination are you in? Or
this was Episcopalian. Now I'm non-denominational, but I grew up more or less in the Methodist and Anglican traditions.
Okay, I come from a Reformed background.
Okay,
and since
my wife's the daughter of a Baptist preacher, so I'm sort of like a cafeteria Christian there. And actually, as a little synchronicity, I'm writing the epilogue to my latest book today, and it's focusing primarily on how I tend to reconcile that. So this is very top of mind for me right now.
Oh, I'll definitely. So for me, I came at this with I wanted to understand the UFO phenomenon, and I started reading. I read Hugh Ross's and. I had him on. I'm forgetting his name, which is a shame. Hugh Ross's book that he co-authored. And, as I got into that, I just went on kind of like a paranormal spiral, if that makes sense. Oh. So kind of went more and more into the paranormal. And one of the things that's been kind of weird for me was that, well, so like when I came up like in a charismatic background, where like, everything's like a demon under wherever, or it's like too far one way. So then I kind of overreacted the other way. And then, I don't know, maybe starting 4 or 5 years ago or so, it's like, or however many years ago, it's like, okay, there's some stuff going on with the UFO, where I'm not thrown. I think I've reached a place where I'm not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, where, not everything is a UFO,
right?
But it could be, or this, and not everything's a demon, but it can be, so so I'm in a good place where I was like, I'm going to start looking at this paranormal stuff where these people aren't just seeing stuff or aren't just making stuff up. I'm going to take their accounts at face value, and not to say they're infallible or some people aren't lying or whatever. And so I started reading, after Hugh Ross's book last year, I read John Keel and I read Jacques Vallée, and somehow your book got recommended to me, I think through an algorithm or something.
For once, the algorithms are doing good work.
And however I got onto your book, so I was like, I don't know what made me do it. And I read your books and I was just like blown away. Like you're kind of achieved your goal with kind of what Jacques Vallée did for UFOs, which was combine the lore with the observation stuff. But somehow it also kind of read like John Keel. And I mean that in a very complimentary way.
Oh no, and that's pretty much on point. I get a lot of those two comparisons. I don't think I'm worthy of either, but they definitely have influenced a lot of my writing style and a lot of my perspectives on things.
Can you hold on 1 second? One of my interview traditions is when I close the door, my cat gets pissed off and starts closing.
Sure, no worries.
Scratching the door.
And I know that you might have to get to work, but I've got the rest of the day just writing. So yeah.
Well, it's early on in my day, so okay. We can go as long as we need to.
Awesome.
Okay, hold on a second.
Okay.
All right, so we'll leave the door cracked so he can come and go as he pleases. Okay, so the thesis of your book, I guess I would try to describe it as there's a lot of high strangeness, which is the bizarre stuff that surrounds the paranormal around Bigfoot. How would you describe your book?
I think that. So this is actually kind of funny. We got a blurb for the back by Patrick Harper, who was a big influence on Timothy and I as well, and he asked me the same thing, like, so what's the thesis of the book? And I said, Bigfoot's weird, Basically, the thesis of the book is I would say an acknowledgement that something strange is going on, and that it doesn't fit into conventional scientific consensus. But at the same time, it is so strange, and there are aspects that are underreported that really seems to push it outside of the realm of materialism that most cryptozoologists flock to.
Yeah, you made a good point in your book, your books, and when I say you, I guess that means collectively, because I don't know who wrote exactly what. And I want to give credit to your co-author as well.
He gets enough credit, it's fine.
Unless it was like one of those, hey, stop. I'm trying to get attention. Unless it was one of those, like, school projects where you carried all the work or something.
No, it really was.
I'm joking. That was a joke.
Yeah, no, it was the sort of thing where Timothy and I were both very compensatory for each other's shortcomings, and I would see something that applied to him, and I'd send it to him, and vice versa. So yeah.
So you've read, everything. You kind of worked on everything together. That
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. Anyway, and whoever your editor was good, because I really couldn't tell who wrote what. I couldn't tell, like, shift in tones, but maybe that's because I'm stupid.
We sort of laid out some groundwork parameters for that, and I think with the exception of perhaps the first 2 chapters of Volume 1, which were essays from earlier books, I think it's pretty consistent. So that's spot on. Yeah.
I wanted to go over kind of 2 things that really struck me before we get into the nitty gritty. The first one was kind of everyone wants to be taken seriously. So I've noticed this. So I go with, I guess the nice way of not saying demons is the interdimensional hypothesis for UFOs. Even maybe some UFOs aren't demons, but whatever. So an interdimensional hypothesis. So if you bring that up with the UFO people, a lot of them are like, no, it has to be aliens, right? Yeah. And so there seems to be a similar interplay. Like they've spent all their life chasing down stuff. They've seen real evidence. They've seen real things, and they want to be taken seriously. So I can see how like I'm sympathetic to them. I can see how an alternative thing coming up, like something where it says, hey, this belongs more in the paranormal, would kind of freak them out or upset them. And then, and the UFO people wouldn't want to be associated with Bigfoot, and Bigfoot people wouldn't be associated with Bigfoot.
Everybody else is crazy. We're the sane ones. Yeah. It's something that I find really quite contradictory, and the thing that really, especially, vis-a-vis the UFO phenomena, and you can extend this to Bigfoot as well, the thing that really gets stuck in my proverbial craw is the fact that, UFO researchers will openly acknowledge the amount of telepathy that happens in encounters. To the extent that, like, people who don't even see occupants will have telepathic interaction with the craft. They'll think, oh, it'll be neat to see a UFO, and one would appear. Or they'll say, hey, little UFO, travel to the left, and it'll go to the left or whatever.
Right, like the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind documentary. Yeah.
And that, if that exists, it completely shatters the materialist paradigm. And some people will quibble with that, but that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of a bunch of scientific philosophers, including people like Karl Popper, I think, who say that, psi phenomena is irreconcilable with the materialist paradigm. And if we're not in the materialist paradigm anymore, then why are we trying to cram the phenomena into the materialist paradigm? The seal has already been breached at that point. So you run into, it's that urge that a lot of people in these disciplines have after being ridiculed for so long. It's this urge to sit at the big kids table, right? It's Thanksgiving dinner.
Acceptance is a hell of a drug, right?
Yeah. And I think that runs contrary to the fundamental nature of a lot of these phenomena, which is kind of faith-based in a lot of ways, even though they don't want to see it as such. It really is about, I think, study of the paranormal is about a sort of personal gnosis more than it is about convincing others. It's about, disclosure doesn't happen from the government with UFOs. Disclosure happens within yourself. You realize that, this world is not quite what it seems to be. And, there are a lot of different facets of that. People will point to, with the UFO question, these artifacts we have, which I really see no differently than, saints' relics. They'll say, oh, well, why would the government want to suppress, UFOs as a spiritual phenomenon? And my response is like, do you have any knowledge of the way that authority structures throughout history have always tried to diminish, religions and spiritualities? I mean, it's a more compelling motivation than the idea that they don't want us to know about little green men. And what I say in my new book that I'm working on is, which would shatter your worldview more? As a 20th century Westerner, 21st century Westerner, that reality looks like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or that reality looks like the Bible or the Odyssey, which upends your worldview more. And that seems to be a good motivation for keeping a lot of these things secret. Regarding the Bigfoot phenomena, I think that a lot of other, quote unquote paranormal disciplines sort of have Bigfoot envy, because there's some absolutely fantastic evidence that these things are flesh and blood creatures, and a lot of the things that they do correspond to primate behavior. But at the same time, a lot of that is predicated on the idea, this very modern idea that non-physical phenomena can't interact with the physical world. And
Yes.
Psi phenomena blows that apart.
So just because something's physical doesn't mean it doesn't have a spiritual aspect or something.
Well, right. I mean, I would say that's a good argument for us, that we are physical and we have a spiritual aspect. And I would assume vice versa, that something primarily spiritual could have a physical aspect as well. The thing that they always say that I mentioned in the book is that, ghosts don't leave footprints. So Bigfoot can't be a ghost. And I'm like, do you have any knowledge of, ghost hunting before 1900, because that was one of the most common ways to ghost hunt, was to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for something to leave footprints. Ghosts slam doors, ghosts, do all these sort of things, to say nothing of the psychokinesis that psychically active people purportedly can do. So it really does seem to be a false dichotomy that we have between the physical and the non-physical. And I think once that starts to break down, it gives you an avenue into exploring these things in ways that are much more, much easier to reconcile with a lot of these, the high strangeness in the physical aspects as well.
I couldn't say that better myself, which is why I'm not an author. Okay, let's just start going through some of the stuff, and I guess you can touch on bigger themes as we go. You kind of start off strong, I think, with the connections to the poltergeist activity, the commonalities between poltergeist activity and Bigfoot. I wonder if you could talk about that for a little.
Yeah. So this is not necessarily my idea, but I think I probably codified it first. That a lot of the things that people report associated with Bigfoot, we're talking about things like, anomalous footprints, voices, especially guttural voices, bad smells, lithoboly, the throwing of rocks, tree knocks, raps in the forest. If you were to transplant all those things into a house, they would into poltergeist activity. And a lot of these reports that you'll find on, for example, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization website are deemed Class B reports because they have these things that happen, but people don't actually see a Bigfoot. So they'll be walking through the forest and they'll have a bad smell and hear a wood knock, and then something will be thrown at them. But you didn't see a Bigfoot. So it is, to some degree, a leap in assumptions that it was a large hairy hominid. And once you see that a lot of these phenomena really are interchangeable and they're very much context dependent in terms of like other things that are happening around them and the culture that witnesses are embedded in, and the witnesses' own predispositions, and also the locations, then you start to say, oh, well, it does look like poltergeist phenomena in the woods. So I sort of coined the term wilderness spirit instead of poltergeist. It's not a perfect term, but I think it does show how many similarities there are and how you can't say it's a Bigfoot unless you saw a Bigfoot. And even if you do see a Bigfoot, the two places where poltergeists manifest the most, outside of alien abductees' lives and near-death experiencers' lives, which it's a very common theme throughout those as well, the two places that you see poltergeists manifest the most are in infestations in houses, and also during seances. And as luck would have it, there are several seances in the historical record from like the golden age of spiritualism where people have manifested large hairy creatures, or hairy hands were a staple of seances as well.
Yeah, I think I read one or two things about that. I just did an overview of Ghostbusters with the background of spiritualism and the Aykroyd family.
Oh wow, that sounds fascinating.
I think he mentioned a hairy hand at some point.
Dan Aykroyd,
or his the book his brother or dad made or something.
For the longest time, I was like, I'm the only Fortean who also plays tuba. And then I found out that Dan Aykroyd is a tuba player. So I got a little competition there, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's cool. I guess the other thing, I guess the weird glowing eyes, how common is that? That's pretty common, or?
I would say it's more common than it should be. It appears. So the common explanation amongst cryptozoologists who are of the flesh and blood hypothesis is that we're seeing eye shine. And there was actually Timothy's chapter, but he does a really good job of showing how A, in a lot of cases, there isn't enough ambient light to produce eye shine. B, not a lot of things have eyes that glow red, which you'll find time and again in these Bigfoot reports. And C, primates, higher order primates, great apes specifically, don't have a tapetum lucidum, which is the reflective surface that you get when you get eye shine from different animals. The reason that we have red eyes in photographs, I don't really know if that's a problem as much anymore with our new technology, but the reason that you see red eyes in photographs is because it's actually light reflecting off of our blood vessels, and that doesn't appear outside of photography, really. So the idea that you could just stumble upon a creature in a dark forest and it would have glowing eyes, to say nothing of stumbling upon a great ape in the forest and having glowing eyes, just is not consistent with any sort of biology that we know of. To say nothing of the fact that, no animal has eyes that bioluminesce, because it would be counterproductive to seeing. You just have this giant glow. So yeah, it seems to be much more aligned with things that you see in folklore, and also phenomena like ghost lights and UFOs as well.
All right, I'm going to pause here.
Yeah.
I need to go take. I hear my dog being bad upstairs, so
Okay.
I'm going to edit this.
All right, you're good.
Okay, I'll be right back.
All right.
Hey, back.
All righty.
Sorry about that.
Oh no, you're fine.
Yeah. Before we keep going, one of the things I should mention, I forgot to mention, was I think one of the good insights. Hugh Ross had in his book, and Ken Samples, and I forgot who the other author was. They had the insight that UFO phenomenon changed over time, got more sci-fi-ish,
Mm-hmm.
and you guys had the insight where things got the Bigfoot sightings got dumber.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's a very sort of Valayan idea, and I can't remember if it was Tim or me who came up with it. But yeah, the UFO phenomena does seem to recontextualize itself. You once had literal like sailing ships in the sky, and then Art Deco flying saucers, and then black military triangles that remind you of the stealth bomber, and then in the modern age, these sort of luminous balls of plasma. And the Bigfoot phenomena seems to be doing the inverse. So as we become more advanced, the UFO phenomena stays one step ahead of us. But as we become more advanced and we sort of, quote unquote, harness nature, the Bigfoot phenomena becomes less. It's as mysterious as it's ever been, but it becomes, quote unquote, less mysterious in terms of sightings, right? So in medieval era, you might have the wild man as something very much akin to, a sorcerer, like a person who can speak and who is magically operant and who is for all intents and purposes just a hairy human. And then in the 19th century and so in the 18th century, you start seeing reports of like, well, they're more animalistic than us, but they're still carrying, an old hoe, or they're still carrying a rusty old musket, or they're cooking with fire, or they're wearing an article of clothing. And nowadays, as we have become so technologically advanced, it seems like it's just a big hairy monkey in the woods, right? So it seems as if the phenomena in both cases is responding to cultural expectations.
Yes.
Now, of course, and some people might say, oh, well, that proves that it's all false because it should remain consistent over time. But if these phenomena are really tied to the human experience in that sort of Valais sort of way, then it makes perfect sense that it would adapt and change.
Well, it seems like there's, I guess, a few possibilities, and maybe they kind of go together. One possibility would be that how people describe something is based on their categories. Another possibility would be like a Jungian sort of expression of the unconsciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And another possibility would be these things are deceptive and are playing off of our expectations.
Right. I mean, and in terms of that last possibility, it does seem like these phenomena wish to retain a certain degree of alienness, right? By which I mean, I think we would be a little bit more open to the idea of a hairy person nowadays than a monkey, and we could maybe incorporate that a little bit better. The Jungian idea, I think, is a really interesting litmus test for a lot of people in the paranormal because, at the end of the day, I think that's the least exotic thing that's going on, the idea that there is a collective unconscious that we're drawing upon. And that's still pretty darn exotic. But you mentioned that to a lot of paranormalists, and they recoil because they have this idea that everything has to be something other than human. But the idea of the collective unconscious actually being something that exists, I think, is still a paradigm shattering idea if it is true. Yeah.
It would have to be some weird mechanism, too.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. The other thing you mentioned, I guess the apports and de-apports and stuff, that's common to, maybe that was common to poltergeist activity, right? You have the dematerialization and shapeshifting, right? So,
right, and you don't really see apports in the traditional sense with Bigfoot, but you can draw a pretty clear analogy between those and the offerings that people get, right? So people will leave behind some food for Bigfoot, and in exchange they'll get some nice rocks, or they'll get a bird feather, or they'll get, in one example that I found, some mice that were woven in this little grass package of woven grass, right? Which definitely implies that it wasn't, a raccoon leaving something behind. With very few exceptions, the things that Bigfoot gift back are also things that are reported during apports. So the question sort of remains, if you didn't see Bigfoot leave it behind, what really left that behind? So are we dealing with a different phenomena than Bigfoot, or are we dealing with the same phenomena, manifesting in poltergeist reports or in Bigfoot reports?
Yeah, so let's talk more about the offerings, because that seems to have sort of a animistic, pagan sort of background, and I guess what happens when you stop giving it altar gifts,
Yeah, so there's an example that I found of a person in Alabama, and again, you can't vet every source, and some stories really do push the boundaries of believability. But according to this individual, his grandfather was a habituator, so someone who had Bigfoot on his property, and he was offering regular gifts to the Bigfoot. And he suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized for a while. And his grandson, who was serving in Kuwait, was not able to take care of, to pick up the slack and continue making the Bigfoot offerings. And he returned to find the grandfather's herd of goats all slaughtered, which has shades of so many other things that you find. There's shades of cattle mutilation in there. There are shades of, even old world dragon myths where, dragons would roam the countryside and ravage herds. And of course, also shades of some fairy phenomena where, this was exactly what happened in the case of a Scottish story where someone was making offerings to a brownie and then suddenly stopped, and sure enough, their herd was wiped out. So it does seem to be as part of a continuum of that, and it does speak to that more paganistic worldview of interacting with something and blood for blood, or offerings for offerings. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other overlaps with the fairy belief?
Well, the biggest stumbling block for people is that Bigfoot is big and hairy, and we don't normally think of fairies that way. But, if you look at fairies, which is a term that I use broadly for all sorts of little people worldwide, but focusing mostly on Western Europe, these are not the ways that we think of fairies today. Fairies were oftentimes not tiny, although they were, but fairies were oftentimes not tiny. They didn't have wings, and they could be hairy, and they were shapeshifters. And if you look at some of the stories of what I call the brownie analogs. So like the actual French goblin, German Peckamderlin, Scottish brownie. They're often described as tiny, hairy, and simian, which is the same description that you find not only in Bigfoot writ small, but also in tales of Littlefoot, which people see these small, hairy hominids across North America, and the conventional explanation is that they're a subspecies of small Bigfoot, or that they're juvenile Bigfoot, and that may well be the case, I suppose. But they do read exactly like the brownies. Beyond that, you've got this really oddly specific tradition of horsehair braiding, which is probably people who don't comb their horses before they put them in the stable at night, coming back and finding their hair a tangled mess. Although there are some people who claim that they do come back after, brushing their horses, and the next morning their hair will be braided. And this is interesting because in some Bigfoot circles, there's this idea that horses like to sneak into stables and braid hair. There's actually a account from Russia that I found where supposedly a Russian researcher found their Bigfoot analog, the Almasty, sneaking into a stable and actually watched the Bigfoot do it. Why he didn't have photographs of this is another story. But what I find really interesting is the way that we have applied that same sort of mundane daily anomaly to Bigfoot that was once applied to things like fairies. That was, if you found your horse's hair braided the next morning after putting it away, that was often regarded as something that the fairies had done, to the extent that even in modern Newfoundland, people will, so some certain parts that are more superstitious will say that, oh, the horses snuck into the stable and braided your horse's hair, or witches as well. The idea that the witches would actually braid the horse's hair to form bridles on the horse's back. One of the, and this, just a couple of things. Power over sleep was often attributed to fairies. In fact, the Sandman might have originated as sort of a nursery bogle. And you find this motif that I call the unrousable sleeper in alien abductions and in Bigfoot encounters, which means that, in alien abductions, it's quite prevalent where an abductee will find that their husband or wife just cannot be woken up, no matter how much they try to, if they can move and shake them, they don't even wake up then, right? During their abductions. You find the same thing in fairy stories, where, a child will be abducted and the mother will get up, but the father just is completely immobile. And,
is that asleep, or do you also see immobilization too?
Yes.
Where you're conscious, but
yeah, usually the other one's asleep. I think it's implied that there's some sort of paralytic altered state of consciousness going on, but it's usually described as being asleep. And then at least two examples that I found of Bigfoot doing the same thing. I mean, besides stories of people seeing Bigfoot and going back to sleep, which I can't imagine, but also something that you see in, alien reports as well. You have these stories of very recent stories of researchers who will be the only ones awake in the cabin, and the cabin will start shaking, and they'll hear something running along the rooftop, and they'll be like, literally, in one case, this Bigfoot researcher started like beating on the people who were asleep and saying, wake up, and they wouldn't budge.
Yeah, I remember that from your book.
Yeah, so that's another thing. And then something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in Bigfoot encounters is the incidents of missing time, which we normally associate with UFOs. And it's something that has antecedents in fairy folklore, where you go to fairyland for 5 years and 500 years would have passed in the real world, or some smaller amount of time. It's something that you see there. It's something that you see in the UFO phenomena, with people saying that a trip home should have taken an hour and it took 5 hours, and then they have hypnotic regression and reveal that they were abducted. But it also occurs in Bigfoot reports. The example that I like to cite the most, it's by no means the only example, but the example that I like to cite the most is Wes Germer from the podcast Sasquatch Chronicles, who said that his sighting with his brother that happened in Washington, once they got back down the mountain, it was a really dramatic sighting where they were in their car and they were watching as these things were circling their car, and they had very good visibility. He said they got home, and I think 4 hours had passed, and he said there's no way it should have taken more than 40 minutes. So that at the time, the co-host that he had on said, "Oh well, when you're in a dangerous situation, time tends to feel shorter than it really is," and that's like literally not true. In other words, there have literally been like laboratory experiments where they've shown that your perception of time actually slows when you're in a dangerous situation. Anyone who's been in a car accident probably knows this as well.
Yeah, or like sports players, when they get in the zone, quote unquote, everything slows down.
Exactly.
That only happened for me when I was in a backyard football game once. I could have used it in other times when I was, I topped out at 6th grade in my sports career. But yeah, no, I think I know exactly what you're talking about, or when you're in a stressful situation, right? Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think about that. Oh, great. I love this dog. All right, so I'll ask my question and then put myself on mute.
All right.
You mentioned telepathy and other stuff. Could you talk another UFO and I guess other paranormal overlap is agitated animals, and you talked about how them being slaughtered and stuff. Could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah. So Bigfoot tend to be famously antagonistic towards animals, which is something that you see in some fairy folklore as well. Definitely in UFO reports, animals are often agitated, and there is some indication that they actually put animals up in trees, which is not all that uncommon in some witchcraft practices and even some fairy practices as well.
Okay. Well, since we've mentioned a lot of overlap with UFO phenomenon, how about the big overlap is seeing Bigfoot and UFOs together, which I would imagine upsets the flesh and blood community and the UFO community, like just make everybody upset.
Yeah, so a lot of this focuses around the work of Stan Gordon, who in, I believe, 1973 was documenting a very robust flap of Bigfoot and UFO encounters. Everything from Bigfoot seen at the same time as UFOs to Bigfoot seen just after or just before UFO sightings in the area. Of course, this is by no means, exclusive to him. You can find dozens, if not hundreds, of similar reports of Bigfoot seen coming out of UFOs or aboard UFOs or any number of things like that. A lot of the flesh and blood cryptozoologists, if they are willing to admit this connection at all, will say, oh, well, the UFO occupants are studying Bigfoot. They're just as interested in Bigfoot as we are, which I have loads of problems with. People talk about Occam's razor in the most simplistic of terms, that, the simplest explanation is the one that's most likely. But what Occam's razor really says is that you shouldn't multiply variables unnecessarily. So I think that it is an unnecessary multiplication of variables when you say, oh, well, the aliens are coming to this planet and they're interested in this giant undiscovered hominid that we also haven't been able to capture or document. I think that's a lot more variables than saying the two are connected somehow. It seems, and the other thing that Timothy says is a very good point. He says, if Bigfoot is a hominid, then we should expect to see Bigfoot, around chimpanzee sightings and gorilla sightings and orangutan sightings, and that doesn't happen. But more presciently, he says, it's a rare occurrence to see a UFO. It's a rare occurrence to see Bigfoot. How many orders of magnitude rarer is it to see them in conjunction? And I think it's a very, very good point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Staying with that, you also mentioned that there's electrical outages, which is a common thing in UFO report. The anomalous lights and orbs that normally now would get chalked up as a UFO, but you're saying that those used to have spiritual significance, and you've seen, you mentioned accounts of Bigfoots turning into orbs of light.
Yeah, this is kind of the first sign that the dam is breaking a little bit in the Bigfoot community. Because I often say that if you can get a ufologist to the bar after their lecture at a conference and you can get a drink or two in them, then they'll start opening up about the strange synchronicities that have happened over the course of their research. And again, of course, synchronicities shouldn't have anything to do with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, right? Because that's a very metaphysical concept. Similarly, if you can corner a Bigfoot researcher and get them to loosen up a bit, you likely will find that they'll say, yeah, there was this one time that we went on a Bigfoot hunt in this area that's known for Bigfoot sightings, and we didn't see Bigfoot, but we saw these ghost lights. And yeah, the ghost lights traditionally have always been attributed spiritual attributes, for lack of a better term. They were everything from fairies to, nowadays UFOs to, the disincorporated soul, to death omens, as well, especially in the traditions from Ireland and the British Isles, actually worldwide. And the connection between them and Bigfoot seems quite long-lasting. There's actually a book from the 19th century by Wirt Sykes, who was writing a book on British goblins, and he makes a passing reference to African-American communities in the American South. And he describes a sort of fairy goblin-esque creature called, according to him, Jack-o'-lantern, which obviously is tied into jack-o'-lanterns and those ghost lights. But he says that it's a creature as tall as a man, covered in hair, capable of leaping great lengths, which is another thing that you see in a lot of Bigfoot reports, that is associated closely with these ghost lights. So that seems to be the earliest, native tribal lore of the Americas notwithstanding. That seems to be the latest or the earliest documentation in literature that you can find of that connection.
Sorry about that. I heard you, but
No, you're good.
Yeah, this just means more editing. Okay, so you mentioned, you also mentioned a lot of shape-shifting, right?
Yes, yeah.
Something, a log turning into Bigfoot. And
that's by far the most common one that you find. People will, if you just look through the BFRO reports, you can find this, where people are walking through the forest and they think something's a log, and then they get startled and when it moves and they realize that it's a Bigfoot. There's one account of a hunter looking through his scope at a Bigfoot that sort of hunkers down, and two other people walk by it and just don't even realize it's a Bigfoot because it looks so much like a log. There's an account from the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, very much people in the flesh and blood camp, of an investigator who was following a Bigfoot sighting because they're triangulating it on their walkie-talkies, and they reach the area and they look in this clearing and all they see are logs on the ground. And they say, "Oh, there's no Bigfoot." And they come back like 2 days later and all the logs are gone, which led this one individual to quip, "We have a motto: shoot all the logs," which is probably not a great stance, but I
shoot all the logs?
We have a motto: shoot all the logs. So you see that, and you also see antecedents in Native American lore where giants will transform into, often hairy giants, will transform into or out of trees, and then this deep connection of Bigfoot with trees in general. Bigfoot. There are some cosmologies that describe Bigfoot actually living within trees and coming out, and that's actually what the popping sound is. It's not a wood knock. It's the creature manifesting in our dimension from almost like sort of a dryad or some sort of other tree spirit. I don't know about that, but there are other stories of Bigfoot shape-shifting into and out of these balls of light, shifting size. Stories. There's one story that is really compelling of these individuals, and I believe it was Pennsylvania, who were four-wheeling around this track, and they saw a Bigfoot walk into the trees. And they said, "Hey, I know where it should come out. On the other side of this track, let's go around and find it." And they get to where they think the Bigfoot should be, and there's like this 1950s greaser standing there, who's smoking a cigarette that I either didn't smell or didn't make smoke or both. I can't remember. But they have a brief conversation with this guy who's in like, it's a muddy day and he's in this like greaser's outfit with these pristine white boat shoes that doesn't look like he's been traveling through the mud. And apparently they look away and they look back and he's gone. You can't say that was shapeshifted Bigfoot, but again, if we're not multiplying variables unnecessarily, you see a Bigfoot and then you see a ghost greaser. Just like, what does that mean? It seems to me like we're dealing with some sort of expression of the same, at least the same mechanism in that encounter. And this is very consistent with a lot of indigenous world. I'm not listing specific tribes right now because I can't remember which stories come from which tribes, but in the book we try to be very diligent about saying which tribes say which things. And
you focus mainly on America, right? You mentioned some because I guess that's what you have access to. I mentioned my Australian friend, the other Paul, who I have on this channel for more theological stuff. He I mentioned, have you heard of? Because I was reading your book. Whatever the Australian version is, and he's like, I hadn't heard of it, so I wasn't sure in other parts of the world how. Yeah. I mean, I think that. For example, I always get them mixed up. I think Kelpies. I get Kelpies and Selkies mixed up. But I believe the Scottish Kelpie is both represented in legends as either what we would call a water horse or a lake monster, right? Or it can be a large hairy man. So, and I think the descriptions are like shaggy, hairy. So you see that as well, and that speaks to a bigger issue, which is the fact that it's not a North American phenomena. Like literally everywhere where humans exist, they have their wildman analogs. And if we're looking at this as something that actually is a genuine primate that has not been discovered, one of those in the Pacific Northwest pushes believability, but for every culture to have one of those and for them all to not be discovered, it seems a lot less likely. And it seems more likely to me that the reason that we don't have any sort of record of this phenomena is because it is something that's inhabiting this in-between realm, and it really is in complete control of whether it gets seen or captured or caught. Yeah, so based on what you just said, let's segue. That's I think common in UFO stuff where like cameras don't work, and sometimes cameras do work, and UFO stuff now we have DoD stuff and that sort of thing. But there's almost this weird, Elon Musk did a tweet last year where it's like, the resolution of cameras and the resolution of UFO stuff. And in my UFO video, I mentioned like, well, this kind of feeds into my interdimensional hypothesis. It's like, and what really, I did all that before I read your book. And when you go over the Trickster archetype, where it's like these, in paranormal in general, it seems like, I don't know what their end game is, but it seems like they really want to mess with people.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I think we have to start redefining things like negative and positive, right? Because we have this association with death being negative, and I think it's a very unhealthy modern outlook. What I'm just wrapping up right now is this book on looking at how all the paranormal speaks to death. So if we can set aside death as being something negative, we can see how the sort of playfulness or deception might not always be a negative thing. Not to say that it isn't, because it's like these stories that you get of people who take a rock from I think it's Mount Kilauea or something in Hawaii, and there are these stories that if you take the rock, you're going to suffer misfortune because Pele is going to be angry, right? And that's the thing that really keeps me from getting any farther into these things in terms of actual experiences or in terms of visiting these sites, is because I'm fine with bringing home a poltergeist. What I'm not fine with is a family member getting cancer or financial ruin or something like that, which honestly for me is kind of worse than death in a lot of ways.
Well, to me, it's not even so much that they're trying to hurt people, which they do sometimes. They're I even heard Jacques Vallée on Joe Rogan's podcast mention that there are deaths in UFO phenomenon, but it's almost like I remember reading in John Keel where there's like a huckster archetype. It's like, hey, this person comes in, it's like, let me show you the UFO. The person sees like the airship or something, and then like this was back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and then the person goes to the press and says, I'm going to have a big disclosure, and then they get embarrassed and nothing ever happens. It's like there's entities there to just mess with people. Like, hey, you saw it on camera, but you couldn't. You're always getting blurry pictures or something.
Right.
It's like they're just having like pranks.
Well, this is a very George P. Hansen idea, who wrote the Trickster and the Paranormal, which it's not an easy book to get through because it is of an academic bent, but it's a fantastic look at how these phenomena tend to thrive in areas of disrepute. They tend to self-negate. Almost every poltergeist story begins with legitimate phenomena and ends in people faking it because they're sort of being forced to perform, right? So there's an aura of disreputability that surrounds all these things, which is why, that old chestnut of, why do alien abductions always happen to people in trailer parks? Well, they're the class of people that we have decided are yokels and hillbillies. That's not true, but that is an area in which these things tend to thrive. And it's because it feels like this stuff doesn't.
Or maybe they're the ones willing to report too.
That's also very true. And that stereotype is not true. There are plenty of people who are of much better social status that have anomalous experiences as well. But yeah, the reporting always tends to skew in that direction. So you have this deliberate obfuscation, this deliberate striving towards constant ambiguity, and the Bigfoot phenomena definitely seems to be part and parcel of that. We can speculate all day about things like, are they reflecting infrared light that doesn't show up on our cameras? Is that why we have blurry photos? Or, is it phasing in and out of dimensions? We can speculate on that stuff all the time, but the end result, I think, is what's most important, which is the fact that whatever these things are, they seem in control of the narrative very much.
Okay, that makes sense. Can we go over the footprints themselves? That seems like to be the best evidence. There's variation in the footprints, but you had mentioned like the weirdness in the footprints too. So
it is great evidence. Every other paranormal discipline has Bigfoot envy. Like it's not only well documented physical evidence, but we have alleged blood, we have alleged hair, we have tissue samples that come up unknown primate. Like this all really does seem to point to something flesh and blood. And the footprints themselves, even though I'm of the high strangeness Bigfoot opinion nowadays, the first book that I will press into someone's hands when they express an interest in Bigfoot is Jeff Meldrum's Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, because Meldrum is an anthropologist and he has done great work in illustrating how these footprints are likely not hoaxes for the most part, because they do exhibit things like dermal ridges, the equivalent of your fingerprint except on your toes, specific primate anatomy like mid-tarsal breaks, which is something that the human foot doesn't have, but it's actually a specific part of a great ape foot anatomy. How the gait seems to be consistent with across different castings and whatnot. But at the same time, there are a ton of stories where people will find one footprint, or they'll find all left footprints, or all right footprints, or they'll find, which is where the two books get their title, they'll find a track of footprints that lead into the middle of an open field and just stop. This last one is especially confounding to the Bigfoot community, and they've proposed all sorts of examples of varying degrees of believability. One is that that's when Bigfoot decided to start brushing out their tracks as they went someplace else, or that's Bigfoot backtracking through their footprints so that they can,
Right, you said there was one footprint that's in the middle of nowhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then one that are just right-handed or left-handed.
Right. Those footprints of all one single foot isn't entirely. It isn't the most common manifestation. The most common thing that you find is that people just run into these trackways that just end, and we're not talking about ending 3 feet from a pile of boulders or a tree line. Yeah, exactly. We're talking about footprints that end in the middle of a field that for like 100 feet in either direction is completely viable media to transmit footprints like snow or mud, and there's just ends. And some people will say, well, Bigfoot are capable of extremely far or extremely high jumps, and I think that the two animals that have the highest or furthest jumps are the snow leopard and the klipspringer, which is a type of antelope, and I believe both those max out at 50 feet. So if you're looking at something in the middle of a field, which, 100 feet is kind of generous. Sometimes it's, obviously we've seen soybean fields and such, like they can be pretty big. Bigfoot is not jumping to any other sort of media that cannot transmit footprints, and they're not jumping to trees because it's in the middle of the dang field. And on top of this, you have this extra layer of peculiarity, which is, these footprints that are 3 toes or 4 toes or 6 toes, oddly enough, or I think there was even an example with like 10 or 11 toes. And I just can't wrap my head around that being something you see from a primate. Moreover, if you look at something like the 3-toed footprints, they don't look like primate feet at all. They look like almost like some sort of chicken foot. People say that, oh, well, these tend to happen in, southern states or in Pennsylvania. In southern states, it must be alligators, alligator footprints that are being drugged. But like, if it's in Pennsylvania, an alligator would be as odd as a Bigfoot. And then the other thing that you'll hear is that, oh, these are inbred populations, but deformities like that don't manifest consistently across both feet. They tend not to. Some people will say that they're wounded or something, but again, these don't manifest across both feet. And if you just take a look at these 3-toed footprints that are associated with like the Falk monster and I believe the Missouri monster, Momo. If you look at these footprints, they don't look like primate footprints. They just don't. The shape is all wrong. The toes are giant, and if somebody's saying, oh, the creature was injured rather, like these 3 footprints are all of equal size and dispersed equally. Like it doesn't look like a foot that is missing a toe or two. Like it just doesn't. And so we're left to add another evolutionary another unique evolutionary trait, along with glowing eyes and being able to leap unfathomable. Right.
I have experience in the intelligent design world, and one thing I noticed from like having a philosophy background is what your presuppositions are limits your options, right? Mm-hmm. So if design is not an option in the biology world, it doesn't have to be the only thing, but that's all you're going to a priori cut it out.
Right.
So it's not like it's like from your starting point, you're just like, you want to take in all the evidence, right? And then say, how does it fit? But if you ahead of time say this has to be flesh and blood, then you have a bunch of evidence that it's a philosophical issue. It's a filter. You have a filter that,
It is, and what it's doing is it's still courting materialism, right? It's still courting this physicalist scientific paradigm. And I think that when you start with that as your framework and nothing else can be true, then of course you're going to be led down the garden path of these extreme leaps in logic.
Right. Can you speak to, you mentioned the Trickster archetype. I leaned on at least your summary, and I bought the book, but I haven't read it yet that you referenced earlier.
Go slowly.
I'll read it a little at a time.
Yeah, it's the sort of book that you read a paragraph and you sit it down and you think, and then you pick it back up.
Speaking of synchronicities, last year in the September, somebody was moving out of their house and they were throwing out books, and I was looking through it, and they had a compendium of a reprint from the 19th century that got published like 20 years ago about fairies from internationally, so which was Persia, Arabia, and Europe. And I was like, just as I was into all this stuff, and then then my wife just started getting into owls.
There you go. Yeah,
and so I wanted you to, and then I follow a podcast called the Sword and Staff, and Ward Heine, who is working with them doing stuff in West Virginia, and a lot of owl stuff apparently came up. And I had mentioned to Ward that about your book, and I was like, you need to like read this, when you're done whatever you're doing about paranormal in West Virginia. Like I said, maybe you want to do something with this, but could you speak to Bigfoots and owls? That would be interesting to them, and it's interesting to me now. So.
Yeah, and the whole owl thing, I mean, so my good friend Mike Clelland has authored several books, and he's by far the world's leading authority on the UFO owl connection, so I can't even begin to summarize that. To suffice to say that there is some sort of connection, and just the owl is such a rich symbol in terms of being a psychopomp and being a death symbol and all this stuff. But and just the owl. Pops. 1, 2, 3. But yeah, so it should be unsurprising that Bigfoot has a real affinity for owls. One of the most common Bigfoot sounds, Bigfoot mimicry that you hear is that people will hear something that sounds like an owl, and it's this deep hoot, and it sounds like an owl that's like, it sounds like a 50-pound owl, right? So that's something that you run into a lot. But it's interesting to note that Bigfoot and birds seem to be connected in some ways as well, in general. People even go so far as to say that like Bigfoot raise ravens to serve as lookouts for whenever people enter the forest. But that speaks to a much deeper connection, which you find with the wild man and apes in general in medieval art. There was this idea that the bird was a soul, and that the ape was a symbol of the carnal delights of the earth, the animalistic delights of the earth. So in a lot of medieval art, you'll see apes pursuing birds. And there are some examples of large hairy hominids being antagonistic towards birds. I believe there are stories of the Vietnamese Ngoi Rung, which is their Bigfoot, throwing rocks to hit birds out of the air. So you have all these things coming together, and on top of that, you have the bird just being. I mean, this is going to sound silly, and it's going to make a lot more sense when people see my book that comes out. But like, I have a hard time differentiating between birds and UFOs symbolically. As intercessors between heaven and earth, and in that soul connection as well. There's a lot of rich symbolism there, and so it just makes perfect sense that Bigfoot would have that same affinity.
One thing Ward Heine mentioned to me, which will be coming up whenever his docuseries is released, is they saw the family he's working with. They saw like I forget what they call it, a thunderbird or something, like a really huge bird. Mm-hmm. Is there anything like that in Bigfoot phenomenon, or like where you're talking like massive bird that's not natural?
Yeah, I mean, so yes and no. The thing that I've noticed recently, which I hadn't really put together, is that in a lot of Native American, especially in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of their iconography, you'll see Bigfoot analogs and large birds or thunderbirds together. A lot of times you'll see them sort of diametrically opposed as on totem poles, which are basically sort of an axis mundi, the navel of the earth, the link between our world and the spirit world. And you'll find the thunderbird at the top of the totem pole, and you'll find the Bigfoot analog, whatever it is, at the bottom of the totem pole. And, you know, in case anybody wants to know if there's a Bigfoot at the bottom of that totem pole, one of the markers of that is to look for sort of a hooting shape of the face, which the cryptozoologists like to say that's
what can you describe what that means?
Oh, so just lips pursed in an O shape.
Okay.
And, you know, cryptozoologists will say that this is...
like it's making a hooting sound?
Yeah, and cryptozoologists will say that this is an expression of, you know, the flesh and blood creatures hooting, and that is a really interesting connection. But generally speaking, if you see that figure in a human shape that looks like it might have some sort of signs of hair or something, that's going to be a Bigfoot analog at the bottom. So you do see them in that sort of iconography together. That's for certain.
Oh... You want to speak to disappearing evidence? This might be part of the Trickster archetype too, right? Where things go missing.
Yeah. So this is something. It's sort of a rule of thumb that you can apply, and it speaks to what we were talking about earlier with, you know, footprints and UFO crash debris basically being the modern equivalent of saints' relics. They're either disappeared, their credibility is undermined, or they seem dubious at best, right? So you have, you know, the most famous example that Tim gives is, you know, the Patterson-Gimlin footage, which we do not have an original copy of that footage. It's always a copy of a copy, and no one really knows where that footage went. But you see this time and again with things like DNA evidence, DNA samples being lost in the mail, Bigfoot files going missing in researchers' cabinets. There was a very compelling skull that Timothy recorded that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but that was sent to, I believe the story goes that it was sent to a researcher at a university who commented on it and then later said, I don't know where it went and I really don't know what you're talking about. So like all the most compelling evidence tends to just sort of have a very dubious chain of custody. And again, I'm very sympathetic towards skeptics' standpoint that this signifies that it's all a load of malarkey. But
well, there's always enough for people like this is where I was like they're trying to mess with you on purpose, where they give you enough to set you up to be embarrassed.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, And that's sort of like where a lot of this book comes from, is that Timothy and I are reasonable people, and we're not true believers in the sense that a lot of people involved in this are. And I'm not saying that to like make ourselves better or whatnot, but like we're both sympathetic towards a lot of these skeptical criticisms. You know,
I can see both sides, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a body. Like that's what I always come back to. We don't have a body of these things, and people will say, "Oh, well, people don't often find bear bodies or cougar bodies." And like, yeah, but they have. Like over the centuries that we've lived alongside these animals, people have.
Both of it's born out of the materialism stuff, right? So when you don't have a spiritual or interdimensional, if we're going to be fancy with it, if you don't have a spiritual option, which I think explains a lot of this, is then what you have is that the people who have seen the evidence and that has the hook on them, like, and you know, this obsession thing is also, you see, I remember John Keel warning about that with UFO research, right? Is that it gets a hook in them, they get obsessed, and then, but they saw something real. And then the skeptics, also coming from a materialistic paradigm, see the problems. So it's like and if I can combine the two, I would say if you expand beyond materialism, I think you have a better picture.
Yeah. I in that sense, everybody's kind of right. You know what I mean? Like from the standpoint that the skeptics, and there's a strong overlap between skeptics and people who just don't have any sort of belief in anything metaphysical.
Yeah, but I don't think they're going to like the solution.
They're not going to like the solution, but it means that within their framework and by their own definitions, they're correct. You know, there is no evidence for the Loch Ness Monster being a plesiosaur. There is no evidence for Bigfoot being Gigantopithecus. You know, there's no evidence that we that we survive death and haunt locations, right? Yeah, I think that's an extremely good point. I was going to say something else, but it completely slipped my mind. So maybe it'll get triggered here in a little bit.
Okay, and then I forgot. I don't know what to say to refresh it, so that's okay.
That's okay.
Do you have? I'm running. I don't. There was so much in your book, so I just took kind of like broad topics. So I'm nearing the end of what I wanted to ask you. One thing that kind of stuck in my mind was cryptids in general. I didn't know how much you researched that, or is that a jumping? I would assume there's a lot of overlap to non-Bigfoot sightings, but I didn't know if you knew or if anybody is doing the same thing you're doing, but with cryptids.
Yeah, well, so there's a reason that I will never do a where the footprints end, Passport to Magonia style analysis of lake monsters, and that's because it's already been done. There's a book that's out of print. I somehow got a really pristine copy, even with an errata sheet from the original publication, and I'm super thrilled about that. Michel Miguer's Lake Monster Traditions is sort of Passport to Magonia for lake monsters. And he does an excellent job of showing how these things are all connected at the symbolic level. Even lake monsters that don't look like, Nessie, like lake monsters that are just big fish, still have the same earmarks of things. So there's that. And, honestly, so we talk about cryptozoology in general, and the more I look into this, the more I'm like, there really aren't a lot of good cryptozoological candidates. I mean, by which I mean, obviously, I think Bigfoot isn't an undiscovered animal. Nessie has way too many symbolic things with apocalyptic dragons at the end of days and death symbols and fairy lore and UFOs. Like, I think that lake monsters are kind of in that same category too. The idea that people put Mothman in the category of cryptids consistently baffles me. As Timothy likes to say, like, you're not going to go find a Mothman egg. Like, that's not a
maybe
thing.
It's just a nice way of saying monsters that people see that aren't Bigfoot.
It is. In terms of things that I think are viable cryptids, most of them are relict animals that we have very good documentation of. So I'm a big supporter of the idea that the thylacine still lives in Tasmania. You're talking about bad footage. Some of that thylacine, if you just treat yourself to something, just Google thylacine or Tasmanian tiger footage, and just go through the internet, and there's some extremely compelling photos of this animal that's supposedly been dead since the 1930s. So I'll support that. Honestly, I could see there being some sort of something approximating a dinosaur in the Belgian Congo, like Mekele Mbembe and some of those other living dinosaurs. I could see that. I wouldn't bet money on it, but I could see that. And honestly, there is room for the discovery of relict hominids. I mean, I think that the one hominid that I keep seeing that is really close to perhaps being identified is Orang Pendek in Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. Some really great evidence for that. And you've also got the supporting evidence in the Homo floresiensis, the hobbits that were discovered about a decade ago, I think. It seems like that there might be a. Like,
what about for overlap that for things that seem to be more paranormal monsters than, but they appear as flesh and blood, like
Dogman?
Yeah, Mothman, Bray Road, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, like, so the Dogman thing is, I will bet the mortgage on Dogman not being a flesh and blood creature for a bunch of different reasons.
But is there a lot of overlap with your research, I guess?
So to the extent that people say, people who are really all into Bigfoot will say, oh, there is no Dogman. It's just the baboon-headed version of Bigfoot, which is like okay, multiplying variables unnecessarily, right? You'll find people say that there are 8 different species of Bigfoot that all correspond to the different regions. You have the skunk apes in the south, which have these feet that look more like, typical pongoid hands, feet, the feet with the the thumb set out the side, and then you have the dog men are actually the baboon-headed Bigfoot. So yeah, there are those overlaps, and you have the overlaps like I mentioned with the Kelpie and lake monsters and large hairy men. David Paulides, before he got on the missing 411 stuff, was into Bigfoot quite a bit, and he had suggested that one of the Hoopa lake monsters, the Kamos, might be misidentified Bigfoot. But if you read the descriptions, they sound like, a horse-headed lake monster more than anything else, river monster. But he's still speaking to that idea that these things, might be connected in some form or fashion. There are plenty of Bigfoot sightings around ancient mounds and monuments in North America, which have strong associations with things like Thunderbirds and Dogman and Mothman. So yeah, it really does seem to be the sort of like soup of cryptozoology more than there are discrete separate things. And I personally think that speaks to a singular phenomena that tends to wear different masks, or
yes,
at the very least, related phenomena that overlap significantly. If you were
like the updated cover of Passport to Magonia.
Yes.
I want one where, and this is my Christian bias showing, but I want one where the main guy's not an alien, but a demon, and then he has all these other.
Yeah. No, I mean,
I want a T-shirt like that, but I don't have an artist.
So you're referring to? So have you seen the full artwork for that?
No, I just
so that cover. I love that cover, and that's great. It's an alien with I think it's like a devil and a fairy maiden and like a 1950s Space Invader, right? But the original artwork, which they weren't able to include, shows that the alien itself is a puppet, and the actual owner of the puppet is out of frame. And
that would be awesome.
So it's actually a puppeteering as opposed to a gray alien puppeteering, and that to me is that's the most eloquent.
I need to get that. Can I get that on a T-shirt?
Yeah, right. I can. It's if you poke around enough, you can find it, and it's great. It's just an arm that's cut off the frame, and then on top of the arm is the gray alien.
All right, offline, I'll have to try to.
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Try to find that with you. Okay, my last question. Before we sum up. Based on, I guess, what I just said, I remember John Keel saying, like, don't go hunting for UFOs.
Yeah.
Would you recommend not hunting for Bigfoot? Like,
I think that there's a good antidote for this, and it's funny. I've been talking about this with a lot of different people lately. But I think that there's a good antidote for this. If you focus solely on this as your passion, so you have your day job and you come home and do this, or if you're foolish enough to try to make a career out of it, if you focus solely on this, either professionally or privately, it will eat your lunch. I'm convinced of that. And that might mean the phenomena doing something to you. That might mean you becoming obsessed. I don't know, but it's not healthy. But I would extrapolate a bit further from that and say that it's probably that way with a lot of things or anything in life.
Yeah, no, that's a separate thing. I was thinking like actually going out and trying to communicate with these things, or.
Well, I'm influenced a bit by the late Jeff Ritzmann, who had a methodology by which he suspected, anecdotally, 60% of the people that he talked to who tried this would have something anomalous happen to them. And his idea was to pick a place relatively isolated, go out anti-structurally, right? So at different times, different days of the week, like don't try to have any rhyme or reason to it. Try to have some spontaneity to it, and have someone that you go with, or go alone, and sit out there in the woods or by that abandoned shack that there's nothing around, and think big questions and talk to something higher. And he said that if you do that for a couple of weeks, something will happen, and it will be what you don't expect. So, if you're expecting to see a UFO, you're going to see a fairy queen walk out of the woods. Or if you're expecting to see Bigfoot, you're going to see a ghost light, right? but his warning that he always said was that, be prepared for this to wreak havoc, because these things thrive on anti-structurality, which is, you'll get into that when you read the George P. Hansen book. Because these things thrive on anti-structure, they will also exert that same influence in your life, probably in a negative way. So be prepared for finances to be ruined, relationships to be ruined, health to suffer, those sort of things. And
that sounds classic demonic to me.
It does, but at the same time, I would also counter that there's a broader tradition of just generalized theophany where beholding the divine as well can have detrimental effects.
Have you ever read The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul?
I have not. I'm going to write that down.
You need to read that.
Okay.
Where anytime you, and he's basing it off, this is probably the best for a popular level, but what he's saying is that in terms of when you come into contact with the holy, which the primary definition of holy is otherness. Purity is like a secondary definition. When you come into contact with God, you're first, or an angel, you fear is your thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what happens in like horror movies too. So even if it's a non-holy otherness, that's why horror movies, you react to how you do. It's when things are creepy or different, or so when you see something, I guess, from another dimension, the other side, that sort of thing, you're going to react. Your natural reaction is going to be fear, not. But he puts it in kind of the Christian context. So when you see people, like when people come in contact with, say, the holiness of Jesus, their reaction is, get away from me, I'm a sinner. They become undone.
Yeah.
So he goes over that. So from a Christian perspective, I'd highly recommend that book.
That
but
sounds fascinating.
It's pertinent to the paranormal field as well.
No, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And it really ties in with a lot of what I'm looking at too, currently. Because it's the thing you hear in NDEs as well, like the number of people who feel that they are, again, not worthy is striking. On a more pragmatic level, you had made allusions to Valet, talking about deaths from UFOs, and that was especially prevalent in the chupa flap of Brazil, which are these refrigerator-shaped UFOs that people would see that they'd literally be killed from right after being hit with a ray of light. But there's another tendency that goes underreported of UFOs as death omens and researchers dying from sudden or rare forms of cancer, which is something I should add. Is consistent with fairy traditions where, fairies would blind you or maim you or cause any number of ill effects. And also, believe it or not, consistent with Rick Strassman's DMT research, where as he got involved in that research, people around him started having horrible ailments afflict them as well, and sometimes just bad luck. So, there is something about it that, and I don't know if that ties into the anti-structurality of it or what, but there is something about it that's not good. So I think the antidote to this, right? I think the antidote to this, and I am going to, pardon the pun, toot my own horn on it. I think I navigate this pretty well, is to have something else that you are very competent at. So you can be a great UFO researcher and you can go out and do this stuff, but know where to draw the line, and then get involved in something else that, you're really good at, and that's a passion of yours. And for me, the flip side of the whole thing is music, and it waxes and wanes. With the pandemic, I've been more involved in this stuff because it's not predicated on having a live audience. But I love music just as much as I love writing about the paranormal, and I think that it's important to keep that balance in my life. And I think it kind of keeps, knock on wood, keeps the wolf at the door. Keeps the wolf from coming in the house. And I think that same approach applied to anything, but the paranormal in specific, I think, is a necessity.
Okay. I recommend prayer too.
Oh, well, yeah, that too.
All right. I definitely want to have you on in the future for your other books and upcoming books, and I wanted to. When I read them, I'll reach out to you, and maybe can have you on in the future. I didn't know if you'd be agreeable to that.
No, that sounds great. Be on the lookout for this next two-parter because it will be your jam. I'm pretty sure it's all about. It's called Ecology of Souls, and it's all about how most of the paranormal is tied to death, but more specifically, soulcraft throughout different traditions, both ancient traditions and Christian traditions. Which is why I'm writing this epilogue today. That's just basically like, well, Josh, you talk a lot about this, but how do you incorporate this into your own worldview as a Christian? Which it's a tightrope, but
all right. Thank you very much. I can't recommend your 2-volume books highly enough. You kind of get the feeling, when you start. I was reading Keel and then Valet, and then once I started reading your thing, it's just like, this stuff ever stop getting weirder?
No, no, it never ends. It never ends. Well, thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure, and I will be better about correspondence next time. I have twin toddlers, and it's just every day is a new challenge.
Oh, I can. Let me top you. I have 12-year-old twins, but when they were born, my oldest was 18 months.
Oh, that's okay, yeah. Well, so I was gonna say, yeah.
You have my deepest sympathies, and but it's triage. Triage is what you need.
Yes, exactly.
But I appreciate it so much, and thank you, and everybody go out and get these books. We didn't even scratch the surface of all the stories and everything, and these books are amazing. I got them on Kindle, but I didn't know if there's any other places besides Amazon they could go. Or
unfortunately, it's published through Amazon.
Okay.
So it's kind of just Amazon. If there's any way for people to buy them from brick and mortar retailers, any of my stuff, I strongly recommend doing that because bookstores are something that I think need to be kept alive. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. It's been a great talk.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.